So they had, what, like 8 years to make Now You See Me, Now You Don't? And they came up with this? Now You See Me, Now You Don't is at best just a bad movie that you can turn your brain off and enjoy in a very questionable way. And at worst, it is an extremely misguided and kinda disrespectful sequel in an already less than sound trilogy. I already made a video about the first two movies, and I do give them a lot of, in my opinion, deserved crap. But even I, an overly pedantic brat and cloud goblin online that I am, subscribe by the way, can admit that the first two movies had their charm and they certainly had their qualities. I still love the first one, it is very cozy. I also still happen to rewatch the second, but I am kind of somehow astounded by how I will most likely never be touching the third movie ever again beyond this review. Sure, I appreciate more Horsemen content, but not like this. I understand that Now You See Me is not some Oscar bait prestigious movie series and shares more similarities with Fast and Furious than The Prestige, but Now You See Me 3 feels like a complete joke even in the context of the franchise, and a very bad one at that. So let's start with a little plot breakdown. It begins with tricking us into believing that the four horsemen are back, but nope, it turns out that there are 3 imposters who are impersonating them by using projections that are surprisingly 3D and lifelike, because the movie has to remind you that it doesn't give a flying shit about how realistic the tricks are. But then we find out that behind those projections are a group of 3 young, hip, and nauseatingly Gen Z magicians named Charlie, who is, I guess, their nerd guy, Bosco, who can mimic the 3 male horsemen, and June, who I don't even know what she does, honestly, I don't remember. But they are essentially a tribute act for magicians because they do things that the OG horsemen did. And this whole movie is also essentially a tribute act for the last 2 movies in a putrid way, because this trio of characters are apparently our protagonists now, and we follow them because the script wants us to. Anyway, after they do their little show where they pretend to be horsemen, they proceed to go home to their little hangout, and boom, there's an older Atlas waiting for the kiddos. He tells them that he got a card from the Eye, and that it led to the 3 of them, and that they have to do this big heist to steal a diamond. And this is where we get introduced to Veronica Vanderburg. She's the supposedly shady businesswoman who mines diamonds and contributes to enabling the worst people on Earth. The actor for Veronica, Rosamund Pike, is having a fun time clearly, but Veronica is perhaps the most boring, underutilized, and least imposing villain across the franchise. So then basically every other former horseman except Dylan proceed to pop up out of the woodworks with the same type of cards that Atlas got, and they all join forces to take down Veronica, which, as far as plots go, it's basic, but for a movie like this it could work. So what is the issue exactly? Why is the elephant in the room begging to be addressed? It's the damn Zoomers, y'all. It's the Gen Z kids, and I say this as a proud Zoomer myself. So the one big gotcha moment of the movie in Act 3 is that it wasn't even the Eye that gathered them all together. No, the whole plan to gather everyone and to take down Veronica is actually masterminded by the Gen Zers. Yeah, so remember in the last video where I tried to liken the first movie to being written somewhat like a magic trick? As in, it has many plots and twists and such, but just like a magic trick, it really works if you stand in only one position, it only works from one point of view. Yeah, so this movie is the exact same way. It basically casts the whole movie into the realm of nonsense in its Act 3, and it creates at least a couple of issues once the reveal happens. Of course, it is convenient that the twist happens at the end, because the movie is already over, and it's basically too late for you to question things too much, since it's already over anyway. So let's address the first thing. Dear whoever made this, if this was some weird attempt at pandering to me as a Zoomer, please stop. No, I do not want to see someone's interpretation of these 3 smug idiots to be put on screen. I do not care about them. And because the movie does what it ends up doing, I never will. To the movie's very small credit, it is their very misguided way in addressing the meta-narrative around the movies. We have to acknowledge that there is a huge gap between the second and the third installments. So the movie, instead of pretending like the studio didn't take a ridiculously long time to put something together, acknowledges it directly by tying it into the plot. The horsemen here are not the same as the ones we last encountered them in the second movie. They are now apart and less on their toes. The new trio are, I guess, a response to them and a presentation of their influence onto the world, which I guess can be cute if you consider that these movies probably did inspire people of my generation to become magicians and probably a lot of others. It is also nice world building, I guess. At some moments it does feel like the 3 kiddos are basically seeing their divorced parents come together and are working to make them reconcile, and it is very, very slightly heartwarming to see them geek out over them, or you can't just be more realistic about what is happening. The studio clearly wants to desperately make this bigger, ongoing franchise and cash in on the Horsemen. But it seems like they had little confidence in the original cast drawing the TikTok-loving Gen Z kiddos to these cinemas, so they just had to inject the plot with these 3 slappable, smug idiots who spout these awful dialogues and act all smart. And all of that is to say that this was not even needed. I happen to think that as part of the Gen Zers, I would have seen this movie without the film trying to cringely appeal at me aggressively. I grew up with the first two. I love the first two as much as I might criticize them. Maybe I am just confidently incorrect and there is some internal market research document within the studio that proves it otherwise. But I would rather have a movie that doesn't do this than a movie that does this in a clunky way. Better have a better movie that appeals to not as many than an awful movie that aims to appeal to too many, if that makes sense. Because do not be mistaken, the presence of this trio, while seemingly a move to appeal to the youngsters, just makes the movie way too cluttered and massively brings down the quality. But what is worse than that, it is not only not necessary at all, it is completely unearned. Am I the only one who felt like this follow-up just does not make sense in the context of the first two movies? This movie feels like they are trying to make the old Horsemen pass the torch to the young Avengers, I mean the young Horsemen. But why in the ever-living fuck would they want to do that? And this is where the movie really wants to flex that none of the original writers were involved in the making of the story. While the first two movies certainly have their flaws, they also have their own charms. I think that while tricks are whack and a way to inflate the CGI budget, the characters are the main attraction. And the first two movies kind of felt like we have just met them. Honestly, I watched the two movies of the Four Horsemen and I don't particularly feel like it should be some end of the road for them. Think about it, we barely know anything about them, and there is so much territory to explore. It doesn't help that narratively both the first and the second movie set these characters up for bigger adventures. The first one's ending saw them prove themselves and be accepted into the mysterious eye, which was damn cool and a nice development. The second one was a bit of a shakeup. We were down a horseman and another one joined in, so it was a new dynamic. But while the first movie saw them be in control of everything, for the second they were not, and were tested once again. And as it turned out, they were once again tested by the eye. It is a bit of a repeat of the first with a slightly bigger push forward, because we actually saw them go down the staircase, and you would think we would finally get some answers as to who the eye is. And you know what, maybe it is a bit foolish of me to expect that we get any explanation on the eye. I am actually okay with not fully knowing because it preserves the mystique, which I am sure would be ruined because I don't really trust this franchise to provide us with a satisfactory explanations. Anyway, I feel like the first two movies are more so an origin story for the Horsemen, with their villains being connected and the Shrike family saga being fully explained, with the Horsemen getting fully to see behind the curtain. All of it just so naturally was setting us up for a third movie that would surely be grander and maybe a bit more serious if it was ever made. Maybe a movie that would actually explain why Dylan ends up in a random Russian prison and why the Horsemen break up. It would have been nice to see the reasoning behind the team breaking up. Even with a huge gap between the movie releases, it still would have worked. Just show the team now being hardened magician criminals who have been doing this for a long while and have them take on the biggest ever heist. It is not that hard. I hate that we barely begin settling in with a new status quo in these movies, and then the third one just decides to shake it up again. And that is why it just does not feel earned. The franchise has not earned its passing it to the younger generations moment, because the team doesn't even feel like they had their proper time to shine. What is there to even pass on? And then the movie proceeds to basically take the plots of the first two, mash them together in various ways, and make that the origin story for the new generation. Not only that, it thinks it is being so smart about it and acknowledges it in the movie.
It's been 10 years since the Horsemen last appeared. So come in close. Closer. Because the more you think you see, the easier it'll be to dress up old tricks and fool you that they are new.
I told you that a new trio in the whole movie was a tribute act. The most egregious example of this is Charlie. This movie decides to copy the character of Dylan from the first one, since the actual Dylan is absent in this one, and makes him this mastermind who is seeking revenge for his mom being killed and takes down Veronica, who is actually his half-sister, except the movie doesn't do it nearly as good as the first one. With the first one, you had Dylan plot out this entire plan with each piece of it being symbolic in some way to really stick it to Thaddeus. It was one of the smarter elements in the movie, since everything laid out clues for Thaddeus to know what was happening, but he was too arrogant to see it. This movie just cuts out the sole fact that it was a relative that was killed by the villain from the first movie, and disposes the rest of the substance. It brings a very how dare you stand where he stood vibe to the table with just how undercooked this whole plot is. The whole twist reveal at the end, with Charlie tricking Veronica into coming into the room that was actually fake and was revealed to be a public stage in Abu Dhabi, is right out of the second movie's Act 3. 3, except, once more, with much less elegance. If you recall, the second movie's last act consisted of multiple little shows that led up to the grand event on the River Thames in London, and they all contributed to the final show. Not as good as the first movie, but still at least some thought in there. The third movie just takes the basic idea of having a reveal like that on stage, and that is it. No smarts about it, no substance, it's just there. And this then just spawns a plethora of questions. For instance, the new trio is not even part of the Eye, yet Charlie seems to be operating just like the Eye would. Charlie and his cronies managed to trick a group of seasoned magicians with their fake-ass cards. Oh, wait. Did I tell you that he completely nerfed the original Horsemen? No, not to sound too woke or anything, but the movie is incredibly ageist, and it kinda paints the Zoomers in an awful light because of it, which I don't particularly like, understandably. If you remember in the original two movies, the four Horsemen consisted of 4 public members and 1 person behind the scenes. And what is notable about them is that they were pretty damn good at what they did. All of them were shown to do what they did as a career before they were scooped up by the Eye. It is fairly safe to say that they had experience and the edge. This movie, however, implies that all of that experience simply melts away and treats the Horsemen as if they aged half a century instead of a few years since they broke up. The movie uses this trope where the new, young, exciting characters suddenly come in and somehow they are smarter than the people who came before them because they are young and hip and know how to use an iPad, which is honestly just bullshit. It is highly unrealistic because no, you most likely will not be smarter in an area than people who have been in it longer, since there are just some things that you will not come to learn except through sheer experience. The movie gives these kids scenes where they are seemingly one-upping the original people, and if that is supposed to entice the audiences to this new generation of magicians, it is not the way to do it. It is not like these kids even show anything we haven't seen before or advanced trickery and magic in any way. The whole movie's premise is that they literally are reusing things from the first 2 movies. I feel like a way more natural direction to go, if go with the young and smug trio at all, is to have their seeming moral and skill superiority bite them in the ass. For all intents and purposes, these 3 kiddos are way too competent for their age without any outside guidance. If you recall, the first movie saw the Horsemen also being relatively young, and they wouldn't have become what they became without the Eye's guidance. It would have been a way more compelling movie if the youngsters were still portrayed as arrogant as they seem at first, if I'm being honest, but have their plan go horribly wrong and have the original Horsemen come in to help them out in a way, not to demean them per se, but just to genuinely help them out and pass on the lessons they themselves might have learned. It would be natural for them to screw it up, and it wouldn't have taken away from anyone's IQ points. There's a scene where the original Horsemen explain to the trio why they broke up, and they outline being cocky and arrogant as being the reason why they messed up an operation badly. That would easily have been a common ground for the 2 teams to thread, and that would have been a way more compelling passing of the torch. But no, instead we get the Horsemen participate in what amounts to a humiliation ritual. And yep, you heard that correctly. This movie is really nothing more than a humiliation ritual for our beloved Horsemen. For this, we have to return to that terrible twist at the end where it is revealed that Charlie is actually the mastermind and that the Horsemen are just tricked into being a part of a bigger plan. This one twist recontextualizes the movie in a very terrible way. Now I feel like the movie doesn't know what the hell it wants, because for a lot of the time we spent it seeing the Horsemen being demeaned and shown that they are now dumb and useless against our genius trio. But then on the same token, the movie implies that the Horsemen do have something to bring to the table, because they are here, right? Since we get to know that it wasn't actually the Eye that brought them together, what are they doing here? They're invited there by the people who seemingly know better than them on top of it, only for the movie to proceed to rub that into their faces. So again, why are they there? Do you see the contradiction? Are you picking up what I'm putting down? It is rather funny that the movie perceives there to be a torch to be passed, but what is there to pass? If the Horsemen are now useless dumb without their edge and also without the Eye, while also being violently mocked by the youngins, at no point do the original Horsemen serve an important role, even more so in the second part of the movie that involves them flying to Abu Dhabi and dealing with Veronica. If anything, the whole capture of Veronica is revealed to be planned out by the trio without the knowledge of the OGs, which renders them even more useless. Literally, the trio just did it themselves. At no point do they actually need the OG Horsemen except for them to be doormats to their brattiness occasionally. To add to this, it is not even like the Horsemen breakup was at any point necessary. Sure, it allowed for the new gen to pick up their appearance turns and tricks, but beyond questionable aesthetics of the movie. Them being broken up brings no narrative value besides a few cringe reintroduction scenes. But also, Charlie being the mastermind raises an insane amount of questions as is, and none of them are solved by the OGs being there either. For instance, we already touched on that somehow Charlie knows how the Eye operates and invites members without actually being part of the Eye, which is nonsense. If he is not part of the Eye, how the hell did he acquire resources to pull this off? In previous movies, the Eye laid out a plan and provided them with the resources they needed to pull it off. It makes sense. The Horsemen also got additional funding from Tressler and also his kid in the second one to an extent. This doesn't happen here, but it does raise insane plot holes as to how Charlie had the resources to have an entire stage to himself in Abu Dhabi of all places, how he managed to orchestrate it all without any connections or the money that the Eye would have given them. OGs are not even actively with the Eye anymore, either. Furthermore, how the hell do the OGs never pick up on the fact that they are being played? I thought that the deal with the Eye was that they would keep contact with someone from the group. I mean, that is how Atlas was tricked in the last movie by Harry Potter, because Atlas thought that he was talking to the actual Eye. Since Dylan is out of this picture, wouldn't Atlas be the second in command after Dylan to have contact with the Eye? Conveniently, this is the detail that the movie doesn't keep from the previous movies, because it would surely set off alarm bells for the OGs if they tried contacting the Eye, and the Eye would have no idea what you're talking about. Furthermore, the fact that the trio uses the exact same tricks as the OGs did is also just salt on the wound. The movie had exactly two ways with this and picked the worst one, because the current scenario is that it is funny haha how the OGs were tricked by the new trio via the exact same tricks that they used, and that just further adds to the humiliation ritual. But it would have been less outrageous if the Horsemen became cognizant of the fact that they were being played. And then we just also have the fact that Thaddeus got gunned down over this little revenge quest by Charlie, which no one really cares about in the end. Everyone is happy that Charlie's this mastermind and successfully took down Veronica, which is insulting all around. So, I think that in the movie's dumbness, there is a lot of simplicity. The last scene of the old Horsemen and the new trio gathering together for one final mission given to them by Dylan basically tells you that the movie thinks it really ate with the way they brought them together. I suppose this is the part where you were supposed to be excited about what comes next. It very much feels like this movie was just basically an awfully sloppy setup for what is to come. But I, respectfully, do not give a fuck about what happens next. Actually, I give negative fucks, because the movie sure as hell gives a fuck about whether I like it, but no, I do not. No, It is a confused, utterly unappealing piece of media that was supposed to pander to the youngins, but it managed to only repulse me by the way they tried to do that at the cost of the old Horsemen. And for that, I have no will to follow this franchise, because in this single movie, they managed to destroy any interest I had in it. Anyways, I hope you're having a great day, and bye-bye.